This SAFE webinar was recorded on May 11th, 2025. Dave St. George and John Dorcey discussed the initial CFI preparation and how to succeed in the test. A lot of resources have been added. Enjoy the program and let us know how you like it. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming on Mother's Day. My name is Dave St. George. I'm the Executive Director of SAFE, and we have another Director of SAFE, John Dorcey, on board to help tonight.
David?
And when we were in the waiting room ourselves, I was getting the full story of 50 years as a pilot. 50 years, he got the Wright Brothers Award, Charles Taylor Award for 50 years, and also a CFI for 50 years. And so, John, I reached out because I'm a DPE and I really don't instruct that much anymore. But John continues to send CFIs and he has a 100% pass rate. So you're in good hands tonight. The guy on the bottom is the ghost in the machine who makes all the magic work, Nick, and he's also the guy behind CFI Boot Camp, and we really appreciate having him tonight. Anyway, the subject is CFI initial evaluation, and we talked about that the last time, and we had so many questions and so many attendees, I thought, why not put it on again? And really going to encourage you guys to ask your questions tonight. The CFI initial is a very confusing evaluation for a lot of people, because it has the selection process and it has things that you haven't seen as a pilot. The FOI really throws a wrench in a lot of people's success. So anyway, the guy you see on the right there, stage right, is just got his CFI certificate. And that's the whole goal of this. We're going to talk about how to get there, what that means, what to be cautious about. The key thing is when you start this process, you're really just accessing everything you learned as a pilot, as a commercial pilot. And that's good news if you learned well. It might be if it's been a while, it's going to be a lot harder. The other thing that I would say right away is we want to look at how that learning went and what you did learn so that you can accurately transmit that to the next generation. All of this information, by the way, is in this blog. It's in written form. It's not obviously spoken, but it has all the links if you don't get them in the chat. And Nick, if you can stick that guy in there, that will give them a clue. There's also a QR here. There it comes. So that QR will take you directly to that blog. And it's got, like I say, if you miss something on this, that should show up as the next piece. And this will be the next webinar for once I'm ahead of the game. And it's Mother's Day tonight. And this one will be on Father's Day in June. So look for that. There's also a QR for that guy there. So step one to becoming a CFI, and I recommend this after every flight, I recommend this after every rating, but everybody that's become a CFI will tell you this. When you start studying for the CFI, what you notice is all the things you thought you knew that you didn't know. Suddenly you realize, oh, I thought I was a great pilot. Oh, I thought I was a great commercial pilot. And as you step up again and start reading the resources, you realize, well, maybe I wasn't so good at this or that. So you have to kind of dig through your knowledge base and make sure that everything you know how to do and practice is accurate. And when we say accurate, we mean to the FAA resources, the handbooks. A lot of people have never seen those because they learned from King Schools, Gleim, Gold Seal, and they're all very good products. But the FAA documents are what the DPEs work with, and that's what you have to access as a CFI. So as a DPE testing this is my nemesis. You know, I get these stories and I say to people, well, where did you get that? And it's inevitably, oh, my CFI told me that. How many times have you heard that, John? The CFI
A lot,
is,
yes.
yeah.
Absolutely.
And some of the craziest stuff comes up. But anyway, we as an organization, SAFE, have worked a lot with CFIs after they get the certificate. Because when you get your CFI certificate, a lot of people think you sort of got the God rating, but any certificate you acquire from the FAA is a pass-fail situation. And if you succeeded, it means at the very worst, you got 70%. And John and I were talking about this before the show too, you know, training standards and how we prepare people. If you use that ACS as a training guide or syllabus, and that's your target, plus or minus 100 feet, that's the minimum standard. So, we have to be training to a much higher standard than that, 50 feet plus or minus. Anyway, this is the program. And if you are a CFI in the audience, and I saw quite a few of you were, this QR will take you to our, what we call the missing manual, all the resources for CFIs that are already certificated. This program we now give at schools, and we travel it. And if you're interested in that, just, right back to the email that was on this, and we'll get back to you. Anyway, a lot of this initial CFI got started when Meg wrote this article for Flying Magazine. This was like a thunderbolt for the industry because it revealed what was actually going on out in the field when this, and I don't think there's anybody that hasn't seen it, but the quick summary is they were taking a dual flight, and the CFI was denigrating his student, calling him a young Forrest Gump and posting this online. And ultimately they ran into a mesoconvective cell and they both died. So it just revealed what was kind of going on behind the scenes. I'm sure you read that, right, John?
Yes, absolutely. David, I have to tell you that when I watched the video and read Meg's article, it made me think and reflect a little bit on my way of relating with the folks that I fly with. And I just hold them at arm's length when I do my initial consult with a potential client. I want to sit down and interview them and find out a little bit about them, but I never go to the point of friending them on Facebook or following them on Twitter or any of the other social media platforms. And primarily because I want to keep that client, learner, instructor distance just a little bit. And it's going to make my job as a flight instructor and eventually an evaluator before we go for the flight test a lot easier. And so for any folks that are really thinking about their first student, I would recommend that you try to keep it just a little bit at arm's length.
And I'd say that's professional. I ran a flight school for a lot of years, 25 years, 141, and we hired a lot of flight instructors. And I think the difference for us at that time was there was a more divergent age group. Now, when I go to like one of these academies, everybody is the same age, and they're going out and having beers at night, and I just think all of that is a little unprofessional. As John said, you need that kind of distance to be a educator, to be a professional, to be in charge. So really watch that, I would say. Too much friending going on, both virtually and literally, I think. So, but the first step, I think in any educational process is going to be that sit down. And what did you call it, John? You had a different word for it. When you sit down?
I treat it as a consultation. So it's just a sitting down and kind of figuring out what's bringing them to the idea that they want to learn to fly. Do they have a family history of it? Is it their first time? And then we kind of go from there.
Yeah, no, and what I for years was trying to find, I think they call it an engagement letter that a lawyer would write for you, and it states what's our expectations, what's our, everything that could possibly, get in the way of a professional, because those come up later. It's a big problem. It's like, should take this long. What I look for too, and I'm sure John's alluding to this, is the head, hands, heart. Do they have the skills in the hands? Do they have the, horsepower upstairs? And do they have the motivation to make it happen? Those three, without one of those, you got two legs on the stool and it falls over. So
David,
sit down. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I would agree with that. And I would also add that the idea is that we want to have an open communication. So at any point, if the learner decides that, hey, this just isn't working out, I hope that they come and we can talk about it. I can certainly recommend other instructors. And I make that a point right away from that initial touch that, hey, we may not connect with the right verbiage. I try to adapt to the student, but to the learner, but sometimes it just doesn't happen as well as I would like. and maybe it just doesn't, the connection isn't there. So I'm always happy to recommend other instructors that might be a potential. I bring that out right away at that initial consult, so that way we start that open communications, that open dialogue right away.
Yeah, and what you're also demonstrating there is, you don't have ego in the game. I'm taking a course on coaching because I thought it'd be helpful because a lot of what we're doing actually is coaching. And the very first process they insist on is what they call a chem check. Are we compatible? Is it something that we're going to spend a lot of time together and you're going to spend a lot of money, and let's make sure. So anyway, that's a basic for all of this stuff. So then we get into what we're talking about with the CFI, and the one thing where'd we go with that? Here it is right here, my Tom Cruise slide. And this used to work pretty good before Tom Cruise became a flight instructor in the last movie. But the Top Gun personality, the fighter pilot, is what I was trying to get at here with the picture on the left. And on the right is the compassionate, patient coach. The CFI certificate is not a piloting certificate. It's, you're not going to get a hole punched in your commercial and you get a CFI, unlike everything else you've had. This one is a privilege to be an educator, and it requires a whole different series of personality skills, primarily emotional intelligence. And I used to seek out people that were educators or parents because they already had that built-in requirement to be part of those groups. But for a lot of people just getting into it, they're really into the personality of the pilot, and they're not really adapted to the personality of the CFI. So the QR on the right, and I recommended this to John too, shoot that with your phone, and it's got 24 questions to sort of evaluate your personality. And if you haven't hung out with enough pilots, you might not know what I'm talking about. But in our club, unless you got pizza and beer, you can't make these covalent bonds, unite. They're kind of suspicious perfectionists, and when you get into the CFI world, you really have to be social and emotional and sharing. And if you didn't know, this is right out. That's not the right one. That's the right one there. This is a required task from Area of Operation 1, the elements of effective teaching, and it emphasizes the positive, minimizes frustration. It's talking all about personality items. And I don't know if you've had one of these, John, but I've had CFI applicants that this one guy, he didn't talk, and after every lesson, he'd go back to his computer and he'd play War of Warcraft or some kind of thing. And he was just a screen guy, and I see that a lot now. I kind of worry about future generations.
I think you're absolutely right. As we move to more and more screen time, it becomes tougher sometimes to interact with folks on a one-on-one, face-to-face. I think that's probably the first disconnect on a lot of particularly newer instructors, is that pre-brief and post-brief periods are maybe the most important part of the entire lesson. So if I could encourage anybody to look at instructors, I always say that there are two kinds of flight instructors: ones that you learn because of, and ones that you learn in spite of. And I'm thinking that a lot of the audience has probably had more than one flight instructor. So I'd encourage you to look back at those folks that you've worked with in the past as you developed your ratings, and emulate the ones that you really felt strong about. And then maybe try to stay away from those habits and style that the instructors that you learned in spite of. But back to your point, though, David, I think that the FOI is probably the number one challenge for a lot of potential CFIs to get up and over, and particularly in the ground portion. And here we are, right? We're looking across the desk or table from a DPE, and it's starting right away. So this is the most important part of the Checkride.
The key difference from this and other Checkrides is this concept of instructional knowledge. When we do a Checkride at private or commercial level, and people are terrified. That's why I'm doing that next the next webinar on anxiety, because I spend a good half hour to 45 minutes before every check ride trying people to calm down. Because unless they calm down, they can't talk. And, the check ride, we're just trying to pull the information out of them. I know it's there. I want them to have the best and most successful test, but we do have to converse and talk across the table, as John said. So getting that skill and tuning that up, at the private and commercial level, definitely when you get to the CFI level, you have to be somewhat eloquent. That is the tool that we use to educate people, is we have to convince and change lives. So that's a verbal skill. And you see it all in this area of operation, professional development. I think on the bottom there, the K5 is what John was talking about with ethics and conduct. We just have to hold ourselves as a professional in the job. The other thing that I wanted to pull out of the CFI ACS was this part here. When you look at that ACS, you'll see that, and this is what I do, that's my ACS. When I see task E and F, I must is a mandatory word the FAA puts in there. These are the ones that I do have to test. So you want to get that CFI ACS, you want to highlight the whole thing. And I have a picture down here that shows the extent to which you should be working with that book. This is from, trying to think, I got from a couple different sources. One was a student I was actually working with, and I asked to borrow his ACS, and that's a picture on the left of his, annotated. So if you go through there, all of those things are going to be asked. It's mandatory. The DPE has to go by those rules. So when you see that a task is required, must select, make sure that you really drill down on that part. Most DPEs, from what I've seen in plan of actions I've collected, will treat the FOI differently. Some will test it directly. Some will test it as you deliver your maneuver lessons. So that does vary quite a bit. But step one is this here, getting your library together as a CFI. You have to have these two books. You have to have the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, probably the risk management book, either in digital form or, I highly recommend paper, because you can highlight and massacre it, right, John? Make it
David,
look
I have to
lived in.
tell you, my library, including the PHAC and the AFH, look just like that previous slide that you had up. When I get done reading a book, I've devoured it. I've made notes. I've written in the margins. I've put the sticky notes like this one has got marked up, and yeah, I wouldn't be able to ever sell any of the books that I've had in my aviation instructor library, because they just wouldn't work for anybody else. But that goes to the idea, I think, that well, a couple of ideas that we have to know our subject to a certain degree. We have to be subject matter experts on a lot of things as instructors, and you can't get to that point without reading it. And I'm a big tactile feel guy. I like to have that paper in my hand and be able to mark it up like this. Online, I've got a copy of it with my ForeFlight, and I can research it there at the airport. But man, I love my hardcover books,
Like the
or
paper, yeah.
my print books. Yeah.
So we got one question here, and I see only two. So you guys get busy and write us some questions. We're here for you tonight. This guy says, working on my CFI, it feels contrived to practice instructing my instructor or practice instructing a DPE. How should I handle this in my training and Checkride? Pretend like I'm instructing a newbie, for example.
Oh, David, can I
Yeah, absolutely. Jump on it.
So when I was working on my CFI, and this is back in 1973, but that just goes to show you how foundational it is. I had my brand new wife with me, and it was in the winter in North Dakota, and I was teaching her all of the processes that I would be teaching any learner at any level. And it was great because she had no clue what I was talking about, which generated lots of questions. And I hope it wasn't just because we were newly married, but regardless of that, the idea was that I could practice. It was somebody that I was comfortable with, and yet that I knew I had to really work hard at to make sure that she understood what I was covering.
Yeah, well, I have one for you. I think every initial applicant for a CFI should probably have a ground instructor certificate. It's not hard to get. When you do your commercial, and definitely when you do your CFI, just do your ground instructor, and then you can officially do the job you're actually instructing. And boy, does that improve a presentation on an initial airplane CFI. And
Yeah.
if you walk in, you're already part of the tribe. You like, oh, here's my ground instructor certificate. So I highly encourage that. We had a school and a club, so we would have the people working on their CFI just teach some of the basic lessons for the privates, and it worked out great. Because yeah, I agree with you. It's hard to, when you have a mentor or a CFI that's senior, to really teach them. I saw a YouTube online. They were practicing initial CFI, and the CFI in the left seat, the senior CFI, put the plane in a spin, and the the applicant, who or the trainee in the right seat, never said, "I have the controls." You have to be ready for that, especially on your maneuver lesson. If the DPE ever takes the controls, you have to be aware that they're going to do something probably pretty stupid, and be ready to assume command, because they play games with you.
David,
Uh,
can I go
yeah,
back to that? Only we're going to do a little bit of a role reversal. Let's put a brand new learner in the left seat and a youngish, experience-wise CFI in the right seat. And so we're starting our takeoff roll, and for whatever reason, the learner jams in full left rudder, and we're headed for the weeds. And the new flight instructor, of course, is taken aback by this whole response, something that was totally unexpected. I like to sit down and explain that whole phrase of "I've got the controls" and what that means, and what you as a learner should do when I say I have the controls. Because that 100-foot wide runway can get pretty narrow at a 45-degree angle at 60, 50, 60 knots. It can get eaten up pretty quick. So I want to make sure that when I say I have the controls, they really are letting go. I don't want to have to fight for them.
absolutely. John, and you're on a good point. There was a school out in California, and I can't remember what, but I was on a webinar out there, and they had a fatal on an intro ride
Yes.
because, and I think when you get along and you get a little overconfident as a CFI, you let people take the controls for the takeoff or the landing, and they're just they're just a citizen. They haven't been in a plane. And when we surveyed our membership at SAFE, 65% of senior instructors had said they had to forcibly take over the controls from a learner. 65%. And we've seen a lot of accidents with young CFIs, and they end up in the weeds, and it's often a bad outcome. And you have to know that could happen at any point. So even on a discovery flight, when I'm taxiing out, I say I have the controls, and we practice it a couple of times. We not only say it, we not only discuss it. When I say I have the controls, I want to see the hands off. We practice that because it's very basic to safety. And if you have a lockup, you should have thought about how you would rectify that situation. And that is one that a lot of DPEs will also simulate on a check ride, that they've frozen on the controls. So what are you going to do to save, because your ultimate responsibility is safety. You've got to keep them safe. And then if they're safe and you've created a safe environment, you can teach. So, but fear does amazing things to people. I've written a couple blogs on that. They're not even hearing your words at that point. They're locked up. So,
Well, and I think too that the learner should then, from that, remember when they are a newly minted private pilot, that very lecture should happen with their passengers during the passenger brief. Is make sure that you stay clear of the controls. And if I say I have the controls out loud, I mean, just all the more I'm reinforcing the idea to back away from the controls. Again, that safety idea. And I think once we start that at that very first lesson, hopefully they'll carry on as they move along in their flying career.
yeah. And and as a DPE, I get, sometimes I get the worst version of people because they're nervous and all this. But what I see a lot too is, and I don't know where this came from, the safe briefing card, SAFE or something, and it's an acronym for all the different things, but they never seem to say, don't handle the controls to the passenger. Keep your hands and feet off, no touchy the handlebars, I'll fly. It's remarkable to me that they don't cover that, because they got the, it's right there within their grasp. And say it is, the scenario I can think of is, say it's son or daughter taking a parent flying, and it gets into a scary situation. The usual role is the parent takes over. They're in charge. They're the senior, and they would tend to do that. So I think it really has to be emphasized that, yeah, don't touch the controls is a critical one when you have a passenger on board. But, all of these things, if you bring them out in a Checkride, a DPE Checkride, the safety aspect of this in the ACS, as you probably noticed, is much, much larger than anything that was in the PTS. Risk management is central to all of the ACS manuals. And the way I usually say it is, in the FAA minimum, the 1 mile clear of clouds class G is like that red dot in the center where no one should ever go there. There should always be a margin around that we don't penetrate, 3 miles or 5 miles. Some of the other remarkable things, if you want to be good at instructing, is sometimes you would take somebody out on a 3 or 5 mile visibility day so they could see what that looks like. I frequently ask people on flight tests at the private level, well, what visibility would you want to fly this Checkride in? And they'll come up with, I want at least 5 miles. I'm like, well, they've never really seen 5 miles visibility, because, here's this cone moving along. It's not really adequate for most VFR flights if it's not a very familiar and flat terrain. So the things that CFIs can do, you can affect safety. I mean, the CFI is the number one influencer of safety. So on your Checkride, I don't think you can overemphasize that aspect. What would you say is the best way to actually teach someone older than you, teaching an adult learner?
Well, sure, David, I can take that.
Go for it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just recently, I think within the last 4 years, added a seaplane rating, and I got a phone call from the instructor, and pre the meeting date, and he introduced himself, kind of like this consult thing that we've been talking about, and he said, I'm sorry, but you're getting the oldest instructor in the school. And I said, well, that's okay. You kind of drew the short straw too, because I'm going to be your oldest student that you'll see at the school this year. And I was 71 at the time. And so from there, we got along famously. I think I've actually had a student into his 80s. I'm talking upper 80s. And I think the first thing is don't discount them based on their age. I think that we all have lots of opportunities to bring things to the process, and whether we're in our upper mid 80s to 18 and around 20, we're all going to bring a different set. First key, I think, would be to, again, this initial consult, find out a little bit about them, but treat them like you would treat anybody if they have questions. But understand too that they're not social media freaks. They're not going to be reading things off the computer necessarily. So you're going to have to adapt a little bit, both your verbiage that you're using and maybe how you're presenting it to them. Don't expect them to be watching a King video or something like that. They'd much rather read those primary resources, David, that we've been talking about.
Yeah. And I think what they're getting at here too is, say it's a 22-year-old and maybe it's just a 45, a professional person. Sure. How do you establish that credibility? Well, when I taught, I used to be at Cornell. Professors would be coming in, and they knew string theory, physics, postdoc, whatever, and they could tell you the chemical analysis of the fuel. It's like, but I know how to fly. This is and it's a big problem. I wrote a blog on this. Those really expert people are very hard to teach because they're not used to being wrong. They're used to, so you really, that's part of that initial sit down talk to really get to the heart of who's in charge. Because if you don't establish that, you're not going to be safe on the one hand, and you're not going to be successful getting your point across. When
I
I
think,
was I just one more thing, John, I'll let you, but my very first student when I was a new CFI was an Air Force general. He had just gotten out of F-16s, and my job was to teach him how to fly a Grumman Tiger. And, I got to say, because he was such a good person and humble soul, I mean, I learned so much from that experience,
right.
both in terms of how to teach and just how to fly a plane. But, we both got along very well because we established the ground rules of how that should work. Yeah,
Yeah, and
John.
I was just going to add, David, that I've been fortunate enough to work a lot with folks in the medical profession, and they actually take critique fairly well if you present it in the right format, right? They're used to being judged as they go through all of the training that they do and continue to do as they move through their career. So I would say that the worst thing that we could do as a flight instructor is to not give them the credit for what they've achieved in their life, but also make sure that they understand that, as you said, David, that we're an expert in our area, and between the two of us, we're going to do great and wonderful things getting you towards your goal.
Yeah, and I would always emphasize, and we were talking a little about this, a little humor, fun. There's nothing illegal about fun and flying, and people get so serious when it's career oriented, but, we're doing something very rare in our whole society. Less than 1% of people fly. We're so privileged. I mean, enjoy it and have a good time with it. There's two questions here. Someone wanted to know the process when someone freezes up on the controls. Well, I can tell you this because it's happened to me several times, but in a Cessna, and you should practice this, in a Cessna, you can put your foot up on that bar that's under that the yoke is attached to, and you can force the nose down because most dangerous situations are an angle of attack situation. And that works very well. You just have to be careful if you're close to the ground because if they let go, it's going to obviously. But I had a big guy on takeoff in a 150 overpower me, and I just, gently eased that down, kept talking to him. He finally, calmed down. But if you get somebody like that, it's usually a sign that you're not doing the instruction well because you've gotten them into a place of fear. You've gotten them too far, too fast. So it's always a wake-up call to an instructor to make sure that you don't try to optimize the syllabus. You have to really watch what's going on with your learner. We're evaluators too, continuously. We have to be saying, okay, they're trying to hide their fear, but are there signs that they really are scared? Don't get them afraid and scared and in a corner because that may happen to you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, David. I actually had the experience where in a 150, sounds common to your issue. I was newly out of the military. He was newly out of the military. The Vietnam War had just gotten over, and he was a door gunner. I was in the Air Force and in a much different career field, but he locked up on stalls and on a stall in 150. And I looked over at him, his eyes were as large as saucers. So I was pretty sure that I wasn't going to get much of a response from him. So I reached over and then banged him on the inside of his elbows, thumped him pretty good, and he let go. But sadly, it was non-communicado after that. We had a very quiet flight the rest of the way home to the airport. But we spent the next year and a half at A&P school together, and we talked about that with some regularity. And but he never did go back into the flight deck. He was more than happy to fix aircraft, but he didn't want to fly anymore, which is really too bad. I took a lot of that on me as a failure on my part. But I think the debrief after something like that happens is huge.
Yeah, for sure. And I wrote a blog last week, I think it was, on reordering the syllabus. Lesson 3 is often the introduction of stalls, and I think that's so inappropriate. I've talked to so many people when you talk to them at a party and they took flying, and they always say, when I got to the stalls, lesson 3, that was the end of it because they signed up to have fun, adventures, fly their family, fun places. They get in the plane, and somebody's, taking the nose and pointing it at the moon, and, they scare them and they're gone. Why do we have 80% of people drop out? Well, there you go. So we encourage people at SAFE to just reorder it and put ground reference first and then stalls later. That's the way the civilian pilot training, all of the wartime training was. The King School syllabus is still that way. It's a much more sensible order to, if you're not in a 141, you can probably do that. What should you do if a student who's been through many CFIs and no one will work with them? Well, I guess it would probably matter how many and what the circumstances would be, but it might be you just haven't found your person yet. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I think that a lot of times I would agree with what you'd said. The sometimes that learner is just looking for the instructor that is going to mesh well with their needs and speak in their language, if you will. That said, not everyone is cut out to be a pilot, and maybe we need to be the flight instructor that says, maybe we should be looking at another opportunity for you to expand your adventure and buy a boat or something along those lines. But not everyone should be a pilot, and I think that's a very hard point to address. But I think in some cases it's necessary.
Yeah, I've only had two that I had to actually say that take up bowling thing, but no, I and I in the current market, I got to say it's tough because a lot of the CFIs you're seeing are just interested in the hours, and there's very little of that essential pre-brief, post-brief. Maybe seek out a smaller school, not an academy, somebody that has time, and I think you'd be more successful. But it's a very hard market to also do your sort of buyer beware shopping because you engage in a school and you're kind of locked in. Anyway, so what I got up here now is the blog. I hope it's showing. But we're talking about getting the resource library, the knowledge part, and that should be both the handbooks and the ACSs. You should get the ACS for both private and commercial because you're building pilots. You have to know what's standard. Somebody asked in here about knowing the regulations. Well, if you went into the the DPE and you didn't know 6187, the solo and the 15 items, you'd be in trouble. And 6193 cross country, you should know those landmark big chunks of learning. Pre-solo everything is 6187. And Nick works with Mike Shiflett, and all he says, he calls them the 15 items. There's 15 items you have to know. And every one of those are going to have a lesson plan that you should create and think about and really work on, because I guarantee that's going to be a focus of the DPE. And once you've got all this done, the bottom part here is build your pilot. You basically take them through from first flight, second flight, third flight. You get the solo endorsement. You talk about the pre-solo quiz. That has to be by memory. If it's something obscure, then sure, you can look it up. And I would absolutely, I'm a big fan of the app, the ASA app, because you can just search it and it comes right up. The tabbed far aim is great for wheel chalk. But I probably wouldn't carry it around with me. But right in my pocket, I have it's $10 for the app, and it updates, and you can memo it. The memos are persistent over updates. I think it's the best tool on the market. And it has more than 61 and 91. It has 121, 135. It's got everything in there. It's very comprehensive. So in terms of looking up, the usual rule of thumb is if it's the standard items for training, that has to be fluid knowledge. Kind of like when you're taxiing, you have to know what the signs mean, lines mean. It's something you have to have by memory. But if it's obscure, then of course you could look it up. The only reference you're usually not allowed to access is the Aviation Instructor's Handbook. You can go through the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. But what we say as DPEs is it can't be an Easter egg hunt. You can't be looking just everywhere for it. You have to know your way around the book. And to that point, it's like John was saying, if you have it tabbed and, marked and highlighted, you got to live with it, because it's not just the test, ladies and gentlemen. When you get done with this CFI temporary, you're going to be doing the job, and you have to know that stuff. And I'll just take a little a little deviation, but we were talking before the show. In Canada, when you get your temporary CFI, you're a class 4 CFI. You really can't teach solo. You're teaching only under the supervision of a class 1 and 2 instructor. In our country, the FAA, you are out there in the wild teaching. So you really want to have a mentor, and all of these things that seem imperious when you're learning them are going to be your everyday 61, 87, 93, 105, 107. You're going to know all those. So it works to your advantage to pick it up before you get into the business. But looking it up is considered fair game. If you're looking everything up, then it is a problem. What do you teach your people? Do you give them a list, John? I used to give them a list of basic regulations.
So yeah, in fact, an instructor that works at a flying club that I'm involved with has developed a online checklist that he provides to all of his learners, and he's allowed me to use it, and it becomes a checklist item for them. That way they know what's expected of them. We make them a participant in the process. And I think that's important. Our learners should know where they're coming from, where they're going to, and where they're at right now. And I think a checklist like that adds a lot to that potential. I do have to say too, David, I think as I was looking at the screen here on your blog going by, and some of the books that you were providing as samples and ideas for other further reading, I think that as instructors, as teachers of flight, that we really need to continue our training. And a lot of the books that you've referenced, I've got in my personal library. Another one that I came across a while back, it's not brand new, it's called The Talent Code by
Love
Dan
that
Coyle.
book. Yep.
And
Dan
it's
Coyle.
an excellent book. Yeah. And
Yep.
I think that if you haven't had a chance to look at that as a almost newly minted CFI, or as a newly minted CFI, or even somebody as old as a CFI as David and I are, it's a great book, I think, to help you get through some of those challenging learners that we might come across, or some of those hurdles that we just don't seem to be able to get over.
Yeah, the talent code, it's not in the aviation ecosystem, is why it's not appreciated.
Right.
Dan Coyle is a science writer for the New York Times, and he had 2 daughters doing Suzuki, and he just examined, and it turns out there's a very metabolic reason why people learn. You just have to practice. Anyway, Amanda Callahan here is sort of languishing, and this is a good time to bring this up. If you have everything done and you cannot finish the CFI boot camp, man, it's just the best thing for you. I mean, they have an accelerated 7-day program down in Miami. Mike Shiflett is, talk about a guy that knows every regulation in the book. He was a DPE and, 16,000 hours. But for a week, he will go through and he will tune up all the parts, and you will get your recommendation for the ride. So when I ran a flight school, there was no CFI boot camp, and I would send people to all kinds of schools, and there was never the kind of quality. Also, if you're an online learner, I mean, that's what Mike Shiflett specializes in. He's Mr. iPad and online, and it really is an effective learning method. He has, I think, you could tell me, Nick, is it a 40-hour ground school to practice?
It is. Yeah. So it's roughly of 40 hours. It's pushing 42 hours, and it covers and brings up the student. It fills in all the technical subject areas that you're expected to understand.
Yeah. So, I mean, very comprehensive. And every CFI that teaches CFIs varies on whether we should get the lesson plans created or you create your own. And I think probably the answer is somewhere down the middle. Especially for the solo and cross country, you should create your lesson plans so that you're familiar with them. But, Mike Shiflett, the CFI boot camp program, they will provide all of those, and they're very good, and you can customize them to your, ability. The one thing I would, and this is getting more into the flying part, a lot of people make the confusion of what's a ground lesson and what are we going to say in the plane. You just have to remember that everything that's taught is taught on the ground. And if you are in the plane with somebody and you're in that busy, confusing environment, it's just, you can remind them. And so what CFI Bootcamp has for that is an iPad app that has all the little, patter cards, the important points that you would tell them. And that comes from the British. They used to have a cassette tape called the patter tape, and you would memorize it. It would talk, a chandelle is 180-degree climbing turn, full power, constant bank through 90 degrees, and then constant pitch with a reducing bank. It's got the. But as a CFI, if you want to be successful in the flight, you have to develop that for yourself. So somebody like Boot Camp has that made if you want to accelerate your training. But I'd say for you, Amanda, what you probably should do is get a hold of Mike at cfibootcamp.com and make that happen before it gets too hot down there. Because, it's a great system, and it's a very solid. I think their pass rate is up in the 90s with a bunch of 7 different examiners. So they do a good job. What do we, CFI candidate, need to look for in a CFI that is helping us to prepare for this step? How do we know they are really preparing us? Well, follow this blog, and they should be taking those steps. But what John said about the consult, any CFI should give you that consult for no charge. They're putting their wares out and saying, here's what I have for you. And if it doesn't feel like the chemistry is right, it probably isn't. You have to find somebody that has time, because a CFI is a really high workload intensive. So you go to Wisconsin, there's a town called Oshkosh, and you meet John Dorcey. I've sent him a couple people who really needed to get it done. One YouTube star, I remember.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
David, I would say to that point is don't be afraid in that consult to ask them what kind of experience do they have in teaching CFIs and what's their success rate. And don't be afraid to look around. You're in charge of your instruction. Don't ever forget that you're the most important person in the equation. And as a teacher, as a flight instructor, I want to make sure that you're getting all that you can get. And if you can't get that from me, I'm going to recommend you on to somebody else that I think can help you. And you should be doing that same thing for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and it's, an honest relationship. And, but it's not going to happen usually at an academy. You're not going to find somebody. So, again, a specialist in this world, a specialist like CFI Bootcamp might be the answer. I mean, there's a couple others I've heard of, but I don't think everyone does it to that level of specialty. So someone's saying double I before the CFI. I personally think that's a mistake, but that's my opinion. I think you should have the airplane first, and I don't think you save that much by going to the double I first. But and I don't know what Mike thinks about that, Nick, but he does have he has a CFII also that follows the CFI, so probably could go either way.
We absolutely do. And then David, also earlier in the chat, we had somebody ask the question about combining the commercial along in preparation for CFI training. So I'd like to get to know your thoughts on that.
I think that's an excellent idea. And that's how I always did it. While you're doing your commercial, you're getting the verbal parts. Because one of the hard things for people is they're so busy with the controls that the brain stopped working. That's why children can't learn to walk and learn to talk at the same time. You're trying to do both at once. And so getting people talking sooner rather than later is very helpful. And I've found they actually learn the maneuvers faster because they're kind of analyzing and talking about them as they're doing them. And pursuant to that, there's nothing that says they can't do it from the other seat either. If they want to get in the right seat early, that's not a problem. There's no command seat in a Cessna, as far as I know. So yeah, combine them and get to talking soon is my take on that. Knowing the CFI Checkride has the lowest pass rate. Ah, untrue,
Oh,
Tony Tadros. It's now the private pilot is winning
right.
with a 77.6 failure rate in the CFI ever since DPEs took over. I hate to say that, but the success rate has gone way up, and it's no longer that dreaded. You have to take it twice. But what do we have to do different on this check ride that we normally wouldn't do to ensure success? And this is Tony is asking the question. The answer there is just go in very prepared. And what I'll tell you is, as a DPE, when somebody walks in organized and they kind of command the room, that confidence, if you can somehow build that in yourself, that's going to go a long ways. And the only way to have that confidence is to be fully prepared and know you got it locked and loaded. You've got things tabbed. And the ones who do best, the books look like what we showed you. They really did the work. Or if they had boot camp or one of those, they really know the materials. You can't take the boot camp stuff and not still read it all, be prepared, notate it. You have to work with any material that you have, because you're going to get an off the cuff question. We know when people have prepared materials, and they've got to demonstrate to us that they know it well. And it's the same as when somebody comes in with ForeFlight and they want to use it on a flight test. I'm fine with that. But if I know ForeFlight better than you know ForeFlight, I'm going to ask you a question and trip you up. You have to know how that app works. It's a tool in your toolkit. So whatever you use, you have to know how to do it well, and you will be successful. So,
David, I just want
And
to underscore one of the words that you use now is confidence. And you really have to be confident in your knowledge and your ability. When I work with someone on the CFI, I'll spend probably 5 times the amount that we're flying in that preparation phase, and where we're actually talking about instructing and student teaching, right? Where he's actually, or she is actually practicing that command of the room, as you said. It goes a long ways to get up to that point where the examiner is going, yeah, this person really knows what they're talking about. It's a lot of just the presentation, the way we're doing it. It's not all fluff. You have to have some meat behind it, but certainly know it cold, know it hands down, and know that you know it. Go into the room, as you said, David, confident.
yeah, go in confident. And it's a weird combination of confident and also humility. If you got it wrong, admit it. There's one person here, Preet Patel. He's at 10 hours of dual given and counting. And he's doubting himself. How does he improve every day as a CFI? How to get better every day in a way that helps your students. Sounds like you need a mentor, Preet. And they're hard to find in today's world, but Dorothy Schick, one of our board members, has an online forum for CFIs, and that meets every Tuesday at Facebook. If you can't find somebody local, the CFI-PRO that we have is designed exactly for you, how that a CFI would improve their skills day after day once you already have the temporary. But a mentor is going to do that same thing if you can find somebody like John Dorcey in your neighborhood to help you along.
You're absolutely right, David. That mentor is so important, and sadly, it is hard to find someone. But again, get if you can find someone that's got a good history, that's the one to choose. The other thing is reflection, right? Your post-flight debrief with the learner. Now it's time for you to sit down and come face to face with the person in the mirror and say, okay, what did I do wrong? What did I do right? What am I going to do different the next time? And good on you, by the way, at 10 hours that you're attending this production and presentation and continuing to learn. I would say, though, that just that kind of stuff is going to add greatly to your success possibilities.
Yeah, that's exactly it. People that become instructors and they just, get the mirror, sunglasses, big watch, and leather jacket and march out there like they're gods. You have to really think, because the joke in CFI world is you ruin your first 5 people you're teaching anyway as you learn the job. You are learning those things. You know,
I
it
never
takes a
heard that
while.
before, David. I've never
You
heard that
know,
before.
no, that's a common. But anyway, Mr. Patel, you're thinking the right way. Look at go get my app, which is called Safe Toolkit, and on the left side there's a part called CFI-PRO, one of the tabs. CFI Toolkit is right on iOS and it's free, no money charge. Like I said, Safe gives it away. But that has a lot of resources for people like you that are looking to improve their chops. Hopefully, we'll be doing more of those CFI-PRO presentations around the country too. We're trying to get industry support for that. The difference between an evaluation critique, where do you draw the line of providing positive reinforcement and real world raw things that need to be said? Well, I think John said that well. You know, you're not critiquing the person, you're critiquing the performance. It's not aimed at the person. It's not you failed, the performance. And I wrote a blog, it's called Learning Zone. And you should look at that, safeblog.org, Learning Zone. And if you have a relationship, instructor and student, there should be no need for excuses or apologies. We just have the goal of getting better. And if you look at the Navy, the way they evaluate every landing, it's just like, you know, we've got to do better or we die in the Navy, you know, but it's a safety issue. And there really is, you know, critique, you should say thank you. And when I'm flying as captain in the jet and the co-pilot says I did, you know, oh, you forgot that, I say thank you. Because we want to do it better. It's got to be a positive, we're all working for the better good and safety. So think of a critique as a gift. And you know, the other thing you can do is have the learner critique themselves, you know, and say, how do you think you did? And then that gives you an inroad to pick up on various points they might need to improve. So a learner-centered critique is a very good technique.
Yeah, I would agree, David. I think too that that word itself, critique, has such a negative connotation. And if we can just step away from that and just say evaluation or reflection would be another word that we could use, something that doesn't sound so negative just from the outset.
Yeah. So Kennedy Woods here says, what is your tips on building a thorough binder for the initial CFI test? So that's old school there. We used to build this big fat binder. What supplementary materials best assist? The thing I wrote in, you should look at this blog because what it mentioned was the letters of interpretation. You should be familiar with some of the basic ones, when you can log PIC, that kind of question. That's a pretty common one. One of Mike Shiflett at CFI Bootcamp's favorite is the endorsements. You know, we get 1/5 of people coming in for flight tests aren't qualified because they don't have the right endorsements, the right experience. And that is a required in area of operation 2, I think it's H, endorsements, H or K. That is a big focus of so make sure you know those cold, and especially ones, I think Mike's favorite is if somebody's already a pilot and they're a helicopter and they're coming across, they don't get a 6187 solo endorsement. They get a 6131 Delta endorsement. So those little subtleties are the things the examiner is often, it's almost like a shibboleth to see if you really did all your work and got down into the weeds. So look at endorsements, look at advisory circulars, look at letters of interpretation. But I have a blog and it's called Starter Kit of Letters of Interpretation. In other words, it pulls out the really important ones because you don't have to read them all. They're endless, but there's about 20 or 30 that you should have some familiarity with. And I tell you, when somebody's on a flight test and they come up with, oh, that's in, you know, the ORD letter. And I say, yes, it is. Because that's what we use in this business of instruction, is we use the FAA documents.
David, when I'm working with CFI candidates, especially if they're pretty savvy with the computer and any kind of a presentation software package like PowerPoint, I recommend that they consider building their notebook with a PowerPoint presentation, and they start with their lesson plans, and then they build actually their lectures and embed videos, clip out photos from the various handbooks and put that right in there. Now, when the DPE is asking you a question, you can go right through your card deck on your PowerPoint presentation and use that as a presentation for whatever maneuver that they've asked you to perform or teach, and then kind of go from there. And you can add to it as you continue to grow and develop your own program right there on your laptop.
Yeah, no, I tell you, when somebody comes in and they start to present like a PowerPoint, I mean, they've already earned a rating a lot of times. I mean, that shows an extra level of effort and an extra level of organization, professional, and it's the kind of materials they're going to use in their job. So it's a key. So somebody said we shouldn't hold these on holidays. I thought, well, it's when did I hold one? It was a big no, it wasn't. It was a big. I think it was Super Bowl night or something.
Oh.
I held a webinar, but you never know when that's going to happen. So, but here's the next one on Father's Day. So, oh well. Is that a big one? Anyway, I thank you all for your good questions. You got started there, and somebody asked if we had to do a lesson plan for the CFI stalls. Probably not, though it's something a CFI can teach. You can't do it until 2 years, 200 hours. So probably not. I would obviously be familiar with it because you got to talk about it in flight. But remember, for the flying portion, it's not a lesson plan. It's that what they call the patter tape. You have an organized way of quickly describing. And incidentally, when you're doing that, the best way is as you're clearing the area, then you're talking about it so that once you get done clearing the area, you're ready to perform the maneuver. I always see people clear the area and then they start talking about it, and we drive for about 5 minutes and then we do the maneuver. It's like, please don't do that. That's not going to be successful. So anything else, John, before we close up?
No, it was great questions. And if we get a chance to do this again, get those questions in early so we can get discussing those.
So we can look up the answers. No.
In our library. That's right.
So this was recorded this time. Somehow David managed to hit the record, and Nick, when he's on board, always records because he's a pro. I'm just a part-time digital guy. I drive planes for a living, but it will be recorded. It will be on youtube.com/safepilots, our YouTube channel. So I usually will take me a week. Believe it or not, I have 7 flight tests this week, so it's a little busy, and 3 jet flights. So one of those weeks, you hope you survive. But thank you all for coming. I hope it was beneficial. You can always write back to our email, and I'd love to hear from you. This, and I hope it's showing. Is that up there, you guys? Questions?
It is.
And it has. So there's 2 things. There's the bit.ly link, and I think if this works, yes, there's also a QR. So any one of those 3 should get you. If you answer those questions, it will propagate to a spreadsheet. I will enter those into FAA Wings, and you'll get your Master Wings credit. Usually takes probably before the weekend would be lucky. So please don't pester me with questions. I will get it by next weekend, and you will have your Master Wings. If anyone's pursuing the Master Wings and needs them in the next week, write me a note and I'll get it done. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Nick, John. Appreciate it. So let's see if we can say good night. Good night.